You think Stalin was a calculated mastermind who never screwed up? Think again. The man who ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist for nearly 3 decades made catastrophic mistakes that killed millions of his own people, weakened his military, destroyed his economy, and nearly cost the USSR its existence. Some of his biggest blunders came from paranoia, others from pure arrogance, and a few were so monumentally stupid that you wonder how anyone thought they were good ideas. Let's talk about Stalin's biggest mistakes, the ones that historians agree were absolutely disastrous and changed the course of history. Let's start with the big one that nearly destroyed the Soviet Union entirely: Stalin's refusal to believe Hitler would invade. By 1941, Stalin had dozens of intelligence reports warning that Germany was preparing to attack. Soviet spies in Germany, including Richard Sorge in Tokyo, sent detailed information about Operation Barbarossa. British intelligence warned the Soviets. Even German soldiers were defecting across the border to warn about the coming invasion. Stalin had so much evidence that war was imminent that ignoring it required active, willful denial. But Stalin was convinced it was all disinformation designed to trick him into attacking Germany first. He believed Hitler wouldn't be stupid enough to fight a two-front war while still battling Britain. He thought the intelligence was British propaganda trying to start a Soviet-German conflict. So he ignored every warning, punished officials who suggested preparing for war, and even ordered Soviet forces not to respond to German provocations along the border. When Germany finally invaded on June 22, 1941, Soviet forces were caught completely unprepared. Airfields had planes lined up wing to wing, perfect targets for German bombers. Ammunition wasn't distributed. Defensive positions weren't prepared. The result was catastrophic. The Germans destroyed over 1,200 Soviet aircraft in the first day, most of them on the ground. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and captured. In the first few weeks, the USSR lost millions of soldiers killed or captured. The Germans advanced hundreds of miles, reaching the outskirts of Moscow by December. Stalin's refusal to believe the warnings nearly cost the Soviet Union its existence. If the USSR had been properly prepared, mobilized, and positioned defensively, the initial German advance would have been far less devastating. Instead, Stalin's mistaken judgment created a disaster that took years and millions of lives to recover from. Then there's the Great Purge, which was basically Stalin systematically destroying his own military leadership right before the largest war in history. From 1936 to 1938, Stalin became convinced that there were conspiracies and traitors everywhere in the military. So he arrested, executed, or imprisoned tens of thousands of military officers. 3 of 5 marshals were executed. 13 of 15 army commanders were killed. Over half of all military officers above colonel rank were eliminated. The Red Army's institutional knowledge, experience, and leadership were gutted. Why did Stalin do this? Paranoia, mainly. He feared the military might turn against him. He believed confessions extracted under torture that named other officers as conspirators. He wanted complete control and saw experienced military leaders as potential threats. The result was a military led by inexperienced officers who were terrified of making decisions without approval from above. When the Winter War against Finland started in 1939, the poorly led Soviet forces performed terribly against a much smaller Finnish army. When Germany invaded in 1941, the lack of competent military leadership contributed to the initial disasters. Stalin eventually had to release some purged officers from prison and reinstate them because the military was so depleted of talent. The purge was a self-inflicted wound that weakened Soviet defenses right when they needed to be strongest. Military historians argue that if Stalin hadn't purged the officer corps, the Red Army would have performed far better in the early stages of World War II, potentially saving millions of lives. Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture was another massive mistake that killed millions through entirely predictable famine. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Stalin decided to eliminate private farming and force peasants into collective farms. The idea was to industrialize agriculture and extract resources from the countryside to fund industrial development. The execution was catastrophic. Peasants resisted by slaughtering their livestock rather than handing them over to collectives. Millions of animals were killed, destroying Soviet agriculture's productive capacity. Stalin's response to resistance was brutal repression. Successful farmers called kulaks were arrested, executed, or deported to Siberia. Grain was forcibly confiscated from villages, even when it meant starvation. The result was the Holodomor, a famine that killed between 3 and 7 million people, mostly in Ukraine and Kazakhstan. People resorted to eating grass, bark, and, in some cases, each other. Villages were completely depopulated. The horror was entirely man-made and entirely preventable. The economic impact was equally disastrous. Soviet agriculture never fully recovered. The USSR went from being a grain exporter to requiring grain imports. Productivity remained lower than in the pre-collectivization period. The forced collectivization achieved Stalin's goal of controlling the countryside and extracting resources, but the cost in human lives and economic damage was staggering. It was a mistake born from ideological rigidity and brutal indifference to human suffering. Stalin's trust in Hitler through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was another colossal error in judgment. In 1939, Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany that included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe between them. Stalin believed this pact bought the USSR time and security. He shipped massive amounts of raw materials to Germany: oil, grain, metals, everything Hitler needed to fuel his war machine. Stalin was literally supplying the Nazi military that would soon invade the Soviet Union. The pact also meant Stalin ignored warnings about German intentions because he'd convinced himself Hitler would honor their agreement. He ignored the fact that Hitler had broken every previous agreement he'd made. Stalin wanted to believe the pact was genuine, so he ignored evidence to the contrary. When Germany invaded, Stalin had helped build up the military machine that was now destroying Soviet forces. The strategic miscalculation was enormous. Stalin thought he was being clever by buying time and gaining territory in Poland and the Baltics. Instead, he was feeding the beast that would nearly destroy the USSR. The decision to defend Kiev in 1941 rather than retreating was another major military mistake. As German forces advanced, several Soviet generals, including Zhukov, recommended abandoning Kiev and withdrawing troops to avoid encirclement. Stalin refused, insisting the city be held. The result was one of the largest military disasters in history. German forces surrounded Kiev and captured over 600,000 Soviet soldiers. The loss of men and equipment was devastating. If those troops had been withdrawn, they could have formed defensive lines further east and continued fighting. But Stalin's pride wouldn't allow retreating from major cities. He famously issued Order No. 227, "Not one step back," which made retreat a crime punishable by death. While this order eventually helped stabilize defensive lines, the early refusal to conduct strategic retreats caused unnecessary losses. Stalin was making military decisions based on political considerations rather than military reality, and soldiers paid the price. Stalin's refusal to allow evacuation of civilians from Leningrad was another mistake that caused immense suffering. When German forces surrounded Leningrad in 1941, Beginning a siege that would last 872 days, Stalin could have ordered mass evacuation before the encirclement was complete. Instead, civilians were trapped in the city as it was bombarded and starved. Over 1 million civilians died during the siege, most from starvation. The suffering was unimaginable. People ate wallpaper paste, leather, and rats. Corpses lined the streets in winter. Why didn't Stalin order evacuation? Some historians argue he wanted Leningrad to hold as a symbol of resistance. Others suggest he didn't want to admit the situation was desperate. Whatever the reason, the failure to evacuate civilians before the siege tightened was a mistake that resulted in one of the worst humanitarian disasters of World War II. Stalin's post-war occupation policies in Eastern Europe created problems that lasted decades. Instead of allowing genuinely independent-friendly governments in Eastern Europe, Stalin insisted on direct Soviet control through puppet regimes. This heavy-handed approach created resentment, led to uprisings in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and ultimately contributed to the Cold War tensions that nearly resulted in nuclear war. If Stalin had pursued a more sophisticated approach, allowing Eastern European countries more autonomy while maintaining Soviet influence through economic and diplomatic ties, the post-war period might have been more stable. Instead, the brutal suppression of Eastern European independence movements created lasting hostility and made these countries eager to escape Soviet control the moment it became possible. Stalin's persecution of scientists and intellectuals was another self-inflicted wound. He had geneticists arrested for not accepting Lysenko's pseudoscientific theories. He imprisoned physicists, chemists, and engineers for imaginary crimes. The aviation designer Tupolev was arrested and forced to work in a prison design bureau. Many brilliant scientists were simply executed. This persecution delayed Soviet scientific development and forced talented people to work in fear rather than freely pursuing research. The irony is that Stalin's Soviet Union achieved significant scientific progress despite his persecution of scientists, not because of it. Imagine what Soviet science could have accomplished if Stalin hadn't arrested or killed so many talented researchers. The space program, nuclear weapons development, and other achievements happened because some scientists survived the purges, not because of Stalin's leadership. Stalin's economic policies created inefficiencies that plagued the Soviet economy for its entire existence. The extreme centralization of economic planning meant bureaucrats in Moscow made decisions about production targets for every factory in the country. This created perverse incentives where factories produced whatever met their quota, regardless of whether it was actually useful. Factories making nails would produce millions of tiny useless nails or a few giant useless nails, depending on whether quotas were measured by number or weight. The lack of price signals and market feedback meant Soviet planners never knew what people actually wanted or needed. Resources were massively misallocated. Quality was terrible because quantity was all that mattered for meeting quotas. Innovation was discouraged because changing production methods risked not meeting targets. Stalin's economic system achieved rapid industrialization but created long-term structural problems that the Soviet economy never solved. Stalin's nationality policies and population transfers were mistakes that created lasting ethnic tensions. He forcibly deported entire ethnic groups whom he suspected of disloyalty: Chechens, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, Koreans, and others. Hundreds of thousands died during these deportations from starvation, disease, and exposure. The survivors were dumped in Central Asia or Siberia and forbidden from returning home. These deportations didn't improve Soviet security. They created lasting grievances and ethnic conflicts that continue today. The Chechen wars of the 1990s and 2000s had roots in Stalin's deportations. The ethnic tensions in Crimea relate to Stalin's deportation of the Tatars. These policies were mistakes that created problems lasting long after Stalin's death. Stalin's cult of personality was another error that damaged the Soviet system. By building himself up as an infallible genius leader, Stalin made it impossible for anyone to question his decisions or offer contrary opinions. Officials were terrified to bring him bad news or suggest alternatives. This meant mistakes weren't corrected because nobody dared tell Stalin he was wrong. The cult of personality created a system where one man's errors became catastrophes because no institutional checks existed. After Stalin died, even his successors recognized the cult of personality was a mistake. Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956 denouncing Stalin acknowledged that the cult of personality had damaged the Soviet system. But by then, decades of Stalin's mistakes had already occurred and couldn't be undone. Stalin's treatment of returning Soviet POWs after World War II was a cruel mistake that betrayed people who'd already suffered enormously. Soviet soldiers who'd been captured by Germans and survived POW camps were treated as traitors when they returned home. Many were sent to the Gulag. Others were executed. Stalin believed anyone who'd been captured must have been a coward or collaborator. The idea that someone might have fought bravely before being captured didn't occur to him. This policy was morally wrong and strategically stupid. It meant Soviet soldiers knew that capture meant death or imprisonment either way, which sometimes made them fight to the death, when surrender might have been more rational. It also meant the USSR punished people who could have provided valuable intelligence about German POW camps and occupation policies. Stalin's refusal to accept help during the 1946 to 1947 famine was another mistake driven by pride. After World War II, the USSR faced another famine that killed over 1 million people. International organizations offered food aid. Stalin refused it, not wanting to admit the Soviet Union couldn't feed its own people. So people starved unnecessarily while Stalin maintained the fiction that everything was fine. Pride killed people who could have been saved. The pattern across all these mistakes is clear. Stalin's paranoia, pride, ideological rigidity, and refusal to accept contrary information led to catastrophic decisions. He purged talented people because he feared them. He ignored intelligence because it contradicted his beliefs. He made military decisions based on politics rather than strategy. He created economic systems that prioritized control over efficiency, and millions of people died as a result. The really disturbing part is that many of these mistakes were obvious to people at the time. Generals knew the military purges were weakening the army. Economists knew collectivization was causing famine. Intelligence officers knew Germany was planning to invade. But Stalin's system made it dangerous or impossible to speak truth to power. So mistakes continued and compounded until they became disasters. Stalin's defenders sometimes argue that his industrialization prepared the USSR for World War II, and that his leadership won the war. There's some truth to this. Soviet industrial capacity did increase dramatically under Stalin. The USSR did ultimately defeat Germany, but the cost was staggering and much of it was unnecessary. A competent leader could have industrialized without causing famine, could have prepared for war without purging the military, could have won World War II without getting caught completely unprepared at the start. Stalin's mistakes killed somewhere between 6 and 20 million Soviet citizens, depending on which estimates you believe and which deaths you attribute to his policies. The exact number will never be known because Stalin's government destroyed records and lied about everything. But the scale of death and suffering caused by his mistakes is almost incomprehensible. We're not talking about minor policy errors. We're talking about decisions that resulted in mass death, military catastrophe, and long-term damage to Soviet society. The legacy of Stalin's mistakes lasted long after his death in 1953. The economic inefficiencies he created continued until the Soviet Union collapsed. The ethnic tensions from his deportations continue today. The environmental damage from his industrial policies still affects former Soviet territories. The culture of fear and lying he created took decades to partially overcome. Stalin's mistakes weren't just historical events, they were catastrophes that shaped the course of the 20th century and continue affecting millions of people today. So yeah, Stalin made some seriously massive mistakes, not minor errors in judgment, but colossal screw-ups that killed millions, nearly destroyed the Soviet Union, and created problems lasting generations. The man was paranoid, brutal, ideologically rigid, and unable to accept he might be wrong. That combination of traits in someone with absolute power resulted in some of the worst policy decisions in human history. Understanding Stalin's mistakes isn't just historical curiosity. It's a lesson in what happens when one person has too much power and nobody can tell them they're wrong.